Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. I decided to make a video on truss rods, and I'd like to focus on a few things. First being, well, what is a truss rod and why they are important to understand their operation and how to make truss rod adjustments on your own guitar. I personally, I think that a truss rod is probably the single most important adjustment you can make to your electric guitar, or any guitar for that matter that has a truss rod. And we'll get into why it is important in a minute. So, what is a truss rod? Well, a truss rod is basically a metal rod that runs the length of your neck from approximately here all the way down to approximately here. And that rod sits inside the neck. And what they do is they router in like a channel, and the rod sits inside the neck, in the middle of the neck, like say something like that. And then they glue the fretboard on top of the neck, and the truss rod sits in there, and you make your adjustments from either this end of the guitar, and some guitars have an adjustment down here. I'll show you a few images later of different types of truss rods, but most modern guitars, you're going to find your adjustment up here, and we'll get into adjusting it in a little bit. So as far as truss rods, there are two types of truss rods. There's a one-way truss rod, which allows adjustment in one direction, and a two-way truss rod, which allows you adjustments in two directions. Now, when you string your guitar up, there's quite a lot of tension on the neck. Those strings, when tuned up to pitch, whatever the pitch of your guitar is tuned to, whatever tuning you're using, there's going to be a lot of tension on the neck. And that string tension has a tendency to bring the headstock side of the neck up this way. And the truss rod helps counteract that string tension. So right now the neck is fairly flat. When you put strings on it, you might see a little bit of an up bow, so the neck may go like this, like a U shape. Okay, I'm exaggerating this to show you what I'm talking about. So what that means is you're going to have a larger gap in this area of the fretboard between the bottom of the strings and the tops of the fret. What that truss rod adjustment will do will allow you to counter that tension and force the neck up and decrease the amount of distance between the bottom of the string and the top of the fret. That way you've got a fairly level surface to play against. Now, most people like a little bit of relief in your neck. That is kind of a personal thing, but I think most people would agree if you take your measurements around the 8th, 7th, 8th fret, you're aiming for 10 to 12 thousandths of an inch. Depending on how you take your measurements, that number can vary. We'll get into that in a little bit. But for right now, let's just keep on with what a truss rod is and what it does. So a one-way truss rod will allow that adjustment in one direction. A two-way truss rod allows it in two directions. So that means you're able to introduce relief into the neck if you need more. So in some cases, the neck will bend the other way. So it's like an upside down U. Again, I'm exaggerating this to show what I'm talking about. So if that's the case, you need to add more relief in the neck, because if you've got your guitar strung up, the strings are going to be very, very close to the frets in this area of the fretboard and further away on the ends of the fretboard. And that'll cause playability issues. You'll get a lot of buzzing, and the strings will choke out, that kind of thing. So you can add relief by turning the two-way truss rod counterclockwise, and that'll decrease the tension on the neck and allow the neck to sit in a more flat position. Now, this is a little easier to show you with an example, I think. So I'm going to stop the recording, and I'm going to set something up to show you what I'm talking about. I think it'll be a little easier to understand if I show you. So I'll be right back. Okay, what I've done here is I've got a piece of painter's tape that I've taped to the back of the fretboard from where you're viewing it from. And I've got my light brought down low, so you can see how it's illuminating this tape. What I've got now is I've got a notch straight edge, they call it. And what this thing does is it sits on top of your fretboard like so. And this notch straight edge will help you see how level your fretboard is. So as you can see, it's sitting on top of the fretboard here. The teeth of the notch straight edge are sitting on the fretboard, and the notched out sections are over top of the frets. That way the frets aren't coming into play when you're laying this thing across your fretboard. This particular notch straight edge is kind of a dual action function. It can function on both a 25.5 inch scale and 24 and 3/4 inch scale. So like a Gibson and a Fender, it'll work for both. Um, you don't need this tool for making a truss rod adjustment, but this is going to make my explanation a little simpler to understand. Let me zoom you in here. Okay, so looking here, this is the 7th, 8th, and 9th fret. We're going to be focusing mostly in this area here. So as you can see, there's some light showing underneath the tooth at the 7th and 8th fret. So right here, oh, focus, right there, right there, this area here. I just got to hold the ruler straight here. So what I've got here is a 6/1000 of an inch feeler gauge. And as you can see, I can slide it just underneath there. It's about 6/1000, maybe, yeah, it's about 6. Yeah, a little less there, maybe 5. But you get the point. You can see the light shining through. The green tape just helps highlight that a little bit more than a white light does. So what I'm going to do now is, that's telling me there's relief in this neck. So we've got a bit of an upward bow happening on this neck. Now I'm going to remove some of that relief by tightening my truss rod. So let me zoom you back out, move you over here. And you can see I've got my truss rod adjustment wrench already sitting in that hole. This is a 4mm wrench, and it slides in there, and it's already locked in place. So it's a hex adjustment in this case. I'll just move this down here. So I'm going to turn it clockwise, or to my right, if I'm facing the guitar. And that should be enough. So let's move the camera back to where we were. So there's our 7th fret there. And we'll put our notch straight edge back on. So you can see there's still a little bit of a gap there, but it should have decreased. So let's check. Yeah, so I can't get my 6/1000 of an inch feeler gauge in there anymore. Let's try 4/1000. Okay, so 4/1000 is in there. So we've taken away a little bit of relief in the neck. So I'm going to tighten that again. Same process as I just showed. Okay, let's see how that looks. Okay, there's almost no light showing underneath there at all. So let's take our 4/1000 of an inch feeler gauge, check that measurement again. Okay, so I can't even get that underneath there. Smallest gauge I got is 2/1000 of an inch. Yeah, that's just barely fitting underneath there. So as you can see, we made a couple of turns with the truss rod at the headstock side, and that gap decreased a few thousandths of an inch. So that's what's happening when you're adjusting your truss rod. Now, if you were to turn your wrench in the opposite direction, in this case, we're going to go counterclockwise, we're going to be introducing relief back into the neck. So we're kind of going back to where we started from. Okay, so let's move back down here. Zoom in. You can already see just from visually looking at it that that gap has increased. Now these are small amounts, so let's use our gauges again to take a closer look. Yeah, 4 thousandths is just getting underneath there. It's probably around 3 thousandths. Okay, so that's what's happening when you're making your truss rod adjustments. I thought it would be easier to show you with this notch straight edge and the piece of tape. Now, to be clear, you don't need these things to make your adjustments. I thought it would just be simple or easier to show you what it looks like, because we are talking very small amounts of change when you make those adjustments. So let's move down to the headstock side since we're looking at that. And we get the wrench out of there. So in the case of this guitar, we're using a hex wrench, 4 millimeter. Hard to see. I'll shine my light in there. You can see it there. Kind of hard to show the light without getting in the way of the camera, but there it is. So it's in there pretty deep. It's sitting about here. So you need a wrench long enough to get it. Now most wrenches like this will work. You can sometimes find one that are longer on this end. Let me zoom you out. That are longer on this end, what makes it easier to get in there and make your adjustments. There are different types. Sometimes you'll get what they call an acorn nut, which is essentially like a socket type of a nut that would sit in here. I have another guitar. I'll stop the video and get it out, and I'll show you what I mean. And sometimes there's a truss rod adjustment at the heel of the guitar, down in this area here. Now, I don't have any guitars that I own that have that type of adjustment, but you would be able to see it right in here if there was one there. I'll dig up some pictures to show you, because a picture would make more sense. So sometimes you'll see like a wheel down here, and sometimes it'll look like a big star or a Phillips head, like screwdriver type style thing, which is quite large. That is where the adjustment is made on certain guitars, is down here. The only downside to that is on like a vintage style Fender, for example, you might have to take the neck off completely to make your truss rod adjustment, put the neck back on, restring the guitar, get it all up to pitch, then make your measurements and check your truss rod adjustment. And if you need to make another adjustment, you got to remove all the strings or take the tension off at the very least. Take the neck off the body, make your adjustment, put it all back together. It's kind of a pain. Some guitars, there's enough of a gap that you can get a specialized tool they make to fit in there. I don't have one to show you, but you'd be able to make your adjustments like this with that special tool. I'll find a picture of that and throw it up on the screen. While it'll be a little easier to understand what I'm talking about. And some have a hex nut and at this end as well, same as what's at the headstock. It just shows up down here. I haven't seen one of those in a long time. I did do work on a guitar recently. I'll get a picture and show you, but the process is the same. It's the same adjustment process you would make. So what I'll show you next is, let me show you what a one-way truss rod looks like. This was a two-way truss rod. So as you saw, we made adjustments in two directions, and we were able to see the gap between the notch straight edge and the fretboard increasing and decreasing as we made slight adjustments to the truss rod. So let me just stop the recording and I'll grab that other guitar. Okay, this guitar here has a one-way truss rod, and you adjust it with this nut here at the headstock. That's what they call an acorn nut. I'm just going to move this string out of the way so you can see a little better. So you make your adjustments the same way as you would a two-way truss rod. You turn it to the right or clockwise to decrease the amount of relief in the neck. Now, with a one-way truss rod, you can't induce relief into the neck like you can with a two-way. So if you were to start turning this acorn nut counterclockwise, you'll get to a point where the nut will literally unscrew itself from the threaded rod on the end here. So if I put my socket, oh yeah, you can see it's super loose already. So it's not doing anything really. That truss rod isn't doing anything. It's just sitting in there. So this particular guitar, like you want to have a tiny bit on here, even if you don't require it. Like let's just say we're going to tighten it, and there, it's just starting to grab. That's the minimum you want on there. You don't want that thing loose and flopping around. You want it to engage to a point where it's going to do a little bit of the work. That's what that rod is for. Otherwise, the strings are going to be pulling on the neck, and that's going to be the only thing countering that string tension is the neck itself, the wood of the neck. So you want to have a little bit of this truss rod engaged. Now, I'd have to take some measurements to see where this thing is at, but I know from previous experience, this guitar just needs a tiny bit. That is likely all it's going to require. And we're talking minor turns here. I maybe did a quarter turn there from where it grabbed and engaged. Now, this particular type of a truss rod, because it's a what they call an acorn nut, you need like a socket style wrench. Let's back you out here. So you need, something like this, or a nut driver. Same thing. This particular guitar uses a 1/4 inch, so you need to have the right size. Other than that, that's really all there is to it. That's the main difference in a one-way truss rod. You only have the ability to reduce the amount of relief in the neck to counter that string tension that's pulling the headstock forward, inducing that up bow situation. Now, you may ask, well, what's the point of a one-way truss rod if you only can adjust it in one direction? Well, to put it simply, most guitars don't really get into a scenario where there is a lot of back bow, where the neck is bending backwards, so to speak. Let me just move the camera here. Hold on. It's a little easier to see from the side. So most guitars, if there's going to be any issue with bow in the neck, it's more than likely going to happen with an up bow situation where there is relief in the neck like this. And that one-way truss rod is more than sufficient to decrease the amount of relief and straighten that neck out to balance the string tension. Very, very occasionally you may need to induce more relief. That's where the two-way truss rod comes in. But generally speaking, that's not normally the case. Normally you're countering the string tension, and a one-way truss rod is more than capable of doing that. Most modern guitars do have a two-way, and I like the two ways because you just have a little more room to adjust them. And there is no good or bad or whatever. It's kind of a preference thing for builders. If you're building a vintage guitar, you might want to have a one-way truss rod in it to match the vintage specs. But we're not doing stuff like that here. We're just doing some basic adjusting and making some changes to the setups and stuff. So this guitar, from what I could tell when I bought it, I looked at it online trying to find out some information. Little tough finding specifics on this. It's an Aria Pro 2, and from what I could tell, it was manufactured in the mid to late 90s. So, this guitar is about 30 years old, and it has a one-way truss rod. That's just the way they are. So just so you understand what you're getting into, if you have a guitar with a one-way truss rod and you are loosening that adjustment screw, be careful, because sometimes if you loosen too much and that nut falls off, you might have a hard time getting it back on. But you will feel it give. Like you'll feel the tension release, and all of a sudden it'll be just super loose, and you'll be able to tell by feel. It's just something to be aware of when you're making those adjustments. I guess the next point is, how do I tell what type of truss rod my guitar has? Ideally, you want to check with the manufacturer specs. If you're buying a new guitar, maybe there's a website you can access or some documentation you can get from the guitar store. Failing that, I would say a good rule of thumb would be any modern newer guitars do have two-way truss rods. They seem to be kind of the standard now. Other than that, there's really no way to tell for sure unless you want to take it to a guitar tech or someone who knows a lot about guitars. They could probably tell you. You could stick your adjustment tools in there and figure it out yourself. Like I say, if you feel this thing starting to loosen off, there's a good chance you've got a one-way truss rod. A two-way truss rod, uh, it'll feel similar, like you'll feel it loosen, and it'll feel super loose. And if you continue to turn, you'll feel it starting to grab in the opposite direction, and you'll be able to tighten it. So technically, you can make this adjustment in two directions, and you are, for all intents and purposes, tightening the truss rod in the opposite direction. I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive to what you're doing, because you tighten when you turn to the right and you loosen when you turn to the left. In the case of a two-way truss rod, if you keep turning to the left, it'll loosen up to a point and then it'll grab and start engaging again. And now you're forcing the truss rod in the opposite direction. So, in a way, you are tightening it in the opposite direction. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, that's about it for how a truss rod operates. I think next we'll just do a quick truss rod adjustment and measure the relief in the neck. And maybe we'll use this guitar to do that since it's already out. So let me stop the video.